Greetings to everybody in Italy, and thank you so much to Professor Mattei for this invitation. And a big hello to Avi Singh. I wish I was there with you all. Getting into my presentation, today I'm going to be talking about community land trusts, and this comes out of my long-time experience, both as a researcher, an advocate, an attorney, and now the executive director of San Francisco Community Land Trust. So the theme of my discussion today is around decommodifying housing through the disaggregation of property, and really looking at community land trusts and limited equity housing cooperatives as legal modes or mechanisms for decommodifying housing. A little bit about my organization, San Francisco Community Land Trust. We were founded in 2003, around the time of the dot-com boom and bust. As many of you know, perhaps in San Francisco, we were the center of the creation of Silicon Valley, and there were many tech companies, initially with dot-coms in the early 2000s. And in this period, we saw a huge amount of speculation and displacement of the local residents. And this led to the creation of the Community Land Trust as a method for stopping this rampant displacement. Today, San Francisco Community Land Trust owns 148 units of housing in San Francisco. We are a CLT that partners with the Limited Equity Housing Cooperative, and I can talk a little bit about that in a moment. And a third of our board are composed of residents. And finally, last year, we received a very large grant of $20 million from Mackenzie Scott, which has really allowed us to ramp up and scale our activities. Why are we talking about community land trusts, and why are community land trusts so important in the scheme of thinking about global capitalism? Well, we've seen the phenomena of what we call the Hedge City. What is this? We're seeing global investment firms, global elites, parking excess capital in private equity firms or through real estate investment firms in cities across the globe. Today, 50% of all direct commercial real estate investment is being made in 30 cities around the globe. And when we're talking about commercial, we're talking about the private investment into these cities. This is driving speculation in land and housing in very unsustainable ways. And as a result, the UN estimates that 1.2 billion urban dwellers across the world are living in housing precarity. And as we see from this chart, $5 trillion have been invested in real estate in these cities, primarily these 30 cities across the globe in the last 10 years. Housing in this mode is treated as a commodity. Why is this permitted to happen? Because housing is understood as a commodity from which individuals can capture value in the form of profits without limits, rather than thinking about housing as a function of need and also as socially created value in the housing. This is another graph that's showing us some of the areas, some cities where there has been a huge amount of rampant speculation. The red cities are where there's more recent speculation. The yellow cities are cities where there's already been speculation and huge overvaluation. San Francisco is among them. We can see also here that Stockholm, for example, has seen a huge amount of increase in the last 12 years. And for example, in Toronto, 50% of the housing prices have gone up by 50%. So we're seeing this phenomena of global investment companies interfering with our cities, making it impossible for local people to live affordably in the cities in which they have grown up, that they're being displaced from their communities. And we really understand that this is creating a huge amount of destruction and fragmentation of our communities. What is a different way in which to think about the relationship between land and housing and value? Well, we can also think about it as socially created value. And I think this is really appropriate because this is a session on the commons. And we can really understand the value around land values as common or socially created values or social wealth. Which is being captured by private property, but in fact is being created by public and private resources or amenities. The real estate mantra, location, 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 is really about something that has absolutely nothing to do with an individual, but rather with wealth, which is created by things like public goods, like proximity to libraries, museums, parks, schools, and public transportation, as well as private amenities like artist studios, restaurants, retail, and grocery stores. So none of those things are things that are created by one individual, and yet we capture them in the form of private property as individual wealth. Part of this confusion, I think, around why we are allowing housing to become a commodity is because the view of housing is that it is really its equity or its investment value rather than the use value to the individuals who live in the housing. We really think of housing just as that value, or perhaps we think about it as the housing itself, but we rarely think about housing is actually four resources. So housing as land, housing as the structure, the building, housing as the people who live in that building and maintain that building and therefore add to the value of it. And then finally, this layer of investment value or equity, which all the focus, I think, in the last 200 maybe plus years has really been focused on, with an acceleration in the way in which the corporations have been involved through these global real estate investment firms over the last, I would say, 10 to 20 years. As we're thinking about how to move away from this model, what is the alternative? The alternative is to think about how we can decommodify housing through law. How can we use law to really create an alternative? And how can we use the community land trust model as one of the mechanisms through law through which we can decommodify housing? Really, in order to decommodify housing, we need to do four things. One, delink the land value from the value of housing through disaggregating ownership, thus capping the returns on investments to reasonable rates. And so what is that? Rather than your building and its value being tied to windfall profits at the speculative rate of the speculative market, it would be capped to something like the consumer price index or the area median income. So indexes that are actually tied to human need and rather than just massive speculative profits. Second, we need to create opportunities for sharing the risk of investments and managing the resource collectively. Many people don't have opportunities to access homeownership. Nor do they have the resources. And so by creating opportunities for sharing the risk of investments and managing the resources collectively, CLTs are also providing greater access to housing and decommodifying the housing. Number three, access to capital for regular people who typically do not have access. Through CLTs, regular people who are living on the margins of society, so people of very low income, are able to access capital to purchase their buildings and their homes when they would not have otherwise. And finally, to decommodify housing doesn't just mean creating the housing and delinking it, its value, but also in mobilizing citizens to engage in local neighborhood development and to scale the model to ensure greater decommodification of housing. Regular people are no longer involved in the activity of creating housing. It's really left to politicians and bureaucrats, and it's a highly technocratic exercise whereby experts make decisions in back rooms with very little consultation from the constituencies and the regular people who live in these cities. How do we achieve greater decommodification of housing? And why are LEHCs and CLTs such an attractive model for achieving this decommodification? Well, it creates greater access to housing for everyone, and especially those in housing precarity. It advances permanent affordability in that mode that we just described, where we delink the value of the land and housing through these resale restrictions, and we'll talk more about how we do this through the LEHC and CLT. It also allows for sharing risk and the cost of home ownership to be shared between individuals in a collective entity that provides oversight and support. It allows for the leveraging of private financing with public subsidies, and it enhances the sharing of costs and burdens of management and maintenance. Homeownership is a really big responsibility. There's a lot involved and a lot of resources that have to be put into maintaining housing. And it may be challenging for one individual to do that, particularly when they haven't had the education or experience. So this allows for greater sharing of those burdens, thus making it also more possible for more individuals to access this type of housing. And finally, it's about building collective political power to decommodify housing. In the way that I just said, most of the time, regular people are not involved in the creation of housing. And so this is helping regular people to get activated and be involved. So let's talk about this first aspect, the delinking of the land value from the value of housing through disaggregating ownership, and thus capping returns on investments to reasonable rates. This brings us to the kind of classic Blackstonian concept of the monolith of property as, really being about exclusion and really being about one abilities to transfer, to the exclusion so you exclude others, and as a result, you own this your castle, your island. It's this idea that it's very, very separate, that this is not something that others can touch, and you, as that sole owner, have the right to transfer that property. This is the original classical idea that we're fighting against through legal realism. So important schools of legal thought, like legal realism, really overturned this concept of the Blackstonian legacy by suggesting that instead property is the bundle of sticks concept. And really, it's for entitlements. And this was laid out by Wesley Holfeld, and this was clarified also in a recent article by Talas Sayed and Anna Dirobilan. Use, exclusion, transfer, and expropriation. And as I mentioned earlier, the focus of modern day capitalism is really on the use, on the exclusion and transfer. So it's really about how do we exclude others from the resource, and then how can we transfer it at market rate? And these are the entitlements that the CLT really works on. And how does it do it? Well, the CLT does this through a mechanism called the ground lease, the 99-year deed covenant over land. And so the CLT splits the title of the land and the housing. So the CLT owns the land through this 99-year deed covenant. So this is I'm really talking through the kind of common law concept rather than the civil law. So the common law has a kind of allergy to restraints on alienation. And so you can't have a restraint on alienation in perpetuity. As a result, we call it 99 years, which is renewable. And so this deed covenant over the land keeps the land permanently affordable. And then the CLT leases or sells the home, or the building, could be also a multi-unit building, to individuals. And they own the home collectively, or in the case of one person, a single family home, it would be one person. And so this split in title between the community land trust owning the land and the individual owning the home really creates a kind of resale restriction or a restraint on alienation, in that the individual cannot sell the land without the CLT's permission and vice versa. And the CLT really being a 501c3 that's really invested in creating and ensuring the stewardship over land. The limited equity housing cooperative works in a very similar way. Again, there's a shared structure. In a limited equity housing cooperative, you're talking about a multi-unit building, most likely. So this is a shared structure. This is a collective that's going to own the structure together in the form of an LLC or another 501c3, depends on the situation. And the collective has their own board. So there's a community land trust board that regulates the land. And then there's a limited equity housing cooperative board that's regulating the use of the actual structure itself. And they actually also then create shares in the structure, which they sell to individuals. And that represents their entitlement to occupy a unit. And this also provides caps on appreciation in the same way that, what I mentioned earlier about caps being based on a consumer price index or an area median income index. The limited equity cooperative will also cap its shares to that sort of index, so creating very, very affordable home ownership. Another aspect of decommodifying housing is creating opportunities for sharing the risk of investments and managing the resource collectively. As I mentioned, the CLT board is made up of 1/3 residents. And so this really allows the residents to be their own also oversight board, in the sense that they're participating in the oversight board. And it's this oversight board that provides enforcement of the affordability restrictions. By acting as a partner with the limited equity housing cooperative, it's sharing in the financial risk, and there's collective care over the resources. And as I mentioned, also it can be a vehicle for political and social movements in the sense of it's engaging regular people in the management of housing as a resource. This is a project owned by SFCLT, San Francisco Community Land Trust, where we're working towards a limited equity housing cooperative conversion. Our very first project in 2009 was also a limited equity housing cooperative, a 21-unit building in the Chinatown area, majority of the population being Chinese. And that building we were able to convert very rapidly in 2 to 3 years. This building we are working to convert now over a 5-year timeline. This is a very diverse population. This is in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, so a very mixed group of people, mostly Latino, Black, and these are people who would never have access to home ownership otherwise. At the Columbus United Cooperative, this first project, home ownership is at the tune of $14,000 a unit. This is the cheapest form of home ownership in San Francisco, maybe even anywhere in California. Here we were able to purchase this building. It was a $10.4 million purchase, and we're able to raise $2.2 million through donations, crowdsourcing, and individual loans towards this purchase. And as I said, we're hoping to convert it in a 5-year timeline to an LEHC. Access to capital for regular people who typically do not have access. So this is another benefit or necessary component of decommodifying housing. The Columbus United Cooperative project that I just mentioned, it is a really good example of a public-private partnership, in the sense that we were able to source capital from a variety of different sources, both public and private. So we had a very large portion, which is this orange portion, which came from the City of San Francisco's seismic loan program. A portion of this also came from a bank, the Federal Home Loan Bank. A portion of this also represents the co-op equity, as well as a commercial unit on the bottom floor that also provided a large amount of the capital. So often community land trust deals involve this unique combination of public and private resources, which allow people who would never have access otherwise to homeownership to be able to access capital towards homeownership. Finally, the last piece of decommodifying housing is around mobilizing citizens to engage in local neighborhood development and scaling the model to ensure the greater decommodification of housing. So as I mentioned, this land trust does this through engaging residents in our own buildings to serve on our board. But then also collectively, each of these buildings can be organized into a limited equity housing cooperative where they have their own board. So there are multiple levels for participation and education in the process of real estate development, law, finance, very complex areas of work that many people don't have a professional background in. They're able to learn these skills, learn the language of power, in order to engage with the cities and with other political groups to advance the decommodification of housing. We, in receiving our $20 million grant last year as San Francisco Community Land Trust, decided to leverage a portion of our funding to ensure the scaling of this model and this growth of collective power. The really biggest challenge for us as community land trusts is building the capacity to do this work. So as I mentioned, law, finance, real estate development, these are all very complex areas of work where people who have these backgrounds can charge a premium for their services. It's very hard for community land trusts and other nonprofits to compete with the private market for these highly professionalized areas of the work. And so we have talent acquisition challenges. Not enough of the talent also represents people in our community. And then there's competition amongst CLTs for this resource, for resources and for talent. And so this is a really central problem in terms of the community land trust's ability to grow and scale and grow its political power. As a result, as I mentioned, San Francisco Community Land Trust engaged in a campaign, leveraging our resources, and convened a group of 14 community land trusts across the entire Bay Area region, representing 8 of the Bay Area counties. And we are really focused on this idea of growing collective power because we really believe that the success of the community land trust model and it is really the key to the success of San Francisco Community Land Trust. At the moment, community land trusts are very fashionable and are being included in the normal affordable housing toolkit. That's not always going to be the case. And there's a lot of philanthropic focus on community land trusts. That also won't be the case unless we can really prove out the model and scale it. And so this is why we're engaged in this campaign. Thank you so much for your time. If you would like to contact me, please feel free to write my email. Thank you so much again for this opportunity to share our work. And thanks again so much to Professor Mattei. Bye, everybody.